Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Ditloff. Matt, it has been 80 years since the founding of the Bretton Woods institutions. I'm sure that is a big kind of moment on your calendar, and you've been waiting for it. You've been gearing up.
Yeah, I'm actually having a party about it.
Yeah, I thought you were going to have a big cake and a $sign form.
That's right. It's one of those sad parties that you have, like when you're trying to celebrate something that's really depressing or kind of hard to get your brain around. So we're out in the backyard. We're all feeling really mopey about Bretton Woods, and we have hot dogs and a cake in the shape of $1. We're all really bummed about the about global finance capitalism and imperialism out here.
Yeah, it's a big dollar cake, but when you cut into it, it is just, I don't know, pickles or something vinegary. Everybody is talking about the Bretton Woods institutions right now because it has been 80 years since they were formed, and usually that refers to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. There's some other stuff floating around, but the IMF and the World Bank are the two biggies. And it's interesting because as people are reflecting on the 8 decades since these institutions were born into the world, people have also been trying to talk a little bit about international financing and kind of post-war reconstruction since the Second World War. And there's a bit of a story that says these institutions were progressive institutions or interesting progressive experiments, but then, dastardly neoliberalism came along and poisoned them and ruined them, and now we really need to kind of recover this origin story of these progressive institutions. But we're here to tell you on this podcast about Christianity and leftist politics that actually maybe there's something more going on with these institutions, things called the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, that we could maybe pull apart in a more critical way.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll get to maybe some of that history in just a minute, which is, okay, it is funny to think about trying to sort of like baptize or whitewash the history of these Bretton Woods ding-dongs, because it's like there's stories that you can't tell without talking about the Vietnam War and anti-communism and all kinds of things like that. So it's like it's a hard sell in the first place, I think. But in case you aren't really very familiar, these are two global economic bodies that are controlled completely by the global north, that basically loan out money to countries in the global south, and then after they do so, make them pay it back, and have a lot of sort of political sway over what they use it on and how it works in these countries. And it leads to headlines like this. This year, Africa will spend $90 billion on debt servicing. So that's not them paying it back. That's just them servicing it. This year alone, $90 billion out of the continent of Africa is a bonkers thing. Or here's another headline that maybe kind of paints the picture as well. Analysis of World Bank and OECD figures show that countries in the global south are likely to pay out $50 billion more in 2024 than they received in grants and loans. So it's just I guess this is the picture that needs to be painted about these kinds of institutions. The countries that are recipients of these loans are not thriving because of them. They're in poverty because of them. They are desperately trying to pay them back and having to sort of shell out more money than they're even getting now that they have it. And with the global north now having more of a say over these countries than in the past, it's a yucky picture. And that's not something that you can just easily whitewash, I think, or at least I'm not going to let people do it. Not on my podcast, that's for sure.
That's right. And also, Africa has been taking center stage in a lot of these conversations, which is interesting because often when people talk about the history of the IMF and World Bank, and they talk about what's called structural adjustment programs, things that we will probably talk about later, often people are referring to Latin America just because there was a lot of political stuff around that, but Africa has found a pretty strong voice. Not that it didn't have one before. Lots of pretty brave and incredible stories of decolonial governments trying to fight with these institutions too. But right now, there's just a lot of energy coming from Africa. And just today, I saw this tweet from Caritas Africa, which is a Catholic kind of aid and development network, that said, the average African country spending on health, education, and social protection is 2/3 of their debt payment. which is nuts. So African countries on average are spending way more basically paying back their creditors than they are on Africans, on their own people. And that is all kind of owing to this incredibly bizarre, unequal international finance regime that we all are forced to live in, that was set up by these apparently progressive people after the Second World War. And we'll talk about how we got there. But I think that's a good place to start, Matt, for sure, is just kind of emphasizing that 80 years later, 80 years after these institutions, what they have built is not a world where everybody is kind of developing in a healthy way on their own terms. But on the contrary, it's 80 years later, these institutions are ensuring that a lot of countries are stuck in debt and not able to invest in the things that people need to live and have a good life.
That's right. Let's talk a little bit more about that history before we just jump, I think, forward into the rest of the conversation. So there's a few different books that Dean and I kind of took a look at to maybe formulate some of these ideas. I think, like, because of the particular religious angle that we're interested in, we had to get a few different books. So we're going to talk about liberation theologians in a minute, but before we get there, we're going to talk about a book from Éric Toussaint and Damien Millet named Debt, the IMF and the World Bank, 60 Questions and 60 Answers. I'm going to tell you about the history here in 1 second, but I do want to recommend this book if you're a person who is kind of interested in these like global finance capitalist sort of organs. It's a cool book. It is exactly what it says on the cover, 60 questions and 60 answers. It's really short and succinct, and it's written for a person who is normal to read them. So you get a lot of great stuff in this book. So on the birth of these big finance capitalist organs in the world, Éric Toussaint and Damien Millet write, after the Second World War, the United States unilaterally set up the European Recovery Program for the reconstruction of Europe, a program better known as the Marshall Plan, proposed by George C. Marshall, U.S. Secretary of State in 1947. The plan made it possible for the United States to massively invest in the European economy with a double objective in mind: help European countries get back into a position in which they could be trade partners and prevent the deteriorating economic situation that might have led to a shift by those countries to the Soviet bloc. About 13 billion, or the equivalent of 100 billion today, went to Europe, including over 11 billion in the form of gifts. 16 West European countries benefited from it. The USSR and East European countries were obviously not eligible. As a consequence, more and more dollars were sent out of the United States, their territory of issue, and started circulating around the world. In accordance with the agreements signed at Bretton Woods in 1944, which is in New Hampshire, fun fact, I guess, which were valid until August 1971, these dollars could be converted into gold. But the U.S. monetary authorities had no interest in exchanging large quantities of gold present in their vaults against dollars they had issued. So this is the beginning of the Bretton Woods institutions. This is the beginning of the World Bank and the IMF. It kind of came out of this weird post-World War II time where the United States saw, the decimated European economy and thought, well, we better save them from communism. So we have to do this whole thing. And I mean, I guess in that sense it worked, but it is kind of interesting to recognize that the formation of these giant regulatory bodies and bank bodies, I guess, finance capital bodies, they are like anti-communist in their nature. That's what they formed out of, right? They didn't want to rebuild Europe for nothing, but because they didn't want the Soviets specifically to win them over or rebuild Europe themselves. I don't know, an interesting historical perspective. So you can't tell the story of these governments, or you can't tell the story of these organizations without talking about anti-communism in some sentiment.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a lot of geopolitics involved in the Bretton Woods Conference itself, trying to parse out what would the global economic arrangement look like following the Second World War. And it was motivated also by reflections on the Great Depression and lots of other kind of things where economists, and this is where people paint it as a progressive conference, economists understood that the capitalist market is way too precarious, way too open to, big booms and busts, and that's not good for anybody. And in an increasingly integrated global capitalist economy, it would get even worse. And so there was a recognition that there needed to be international finance regulations and also funds and banks that were trying to basically send money or lend money rather to other countries in order to even out some of the balance, encourage or spark development in the global south, especially. So there was this kind of sense that, it's a very optimistic liberal scheme that you would be able to lend all this money out. Everybody kind of wins. The rich countries lend the money out to poor countries or countries that are really in need. Those countries use the money to build their own infrastructure, invest in their own economies. And then, granted, that's definitely going to turn a profit. And so they'll turn all those profits back to the global north in the form of debt repayments, where they'll also make money. So everybody makes money. That's kind of the idea. And it was formulated by a U.S. Official, Harry Dexter White, who is a kind of interesting, very weird economist, and also John Maynard Keynes, who, again, is a very complicated progressive economist. And lots to say about it. The Soviet Union, for example, was involved in the conference, but by the end of it, they quit, and they were like, this is actually bad in the end, and they kind of saw the writing on the wall that these institutions, as they said at the UN, would essentially cement U.S. Hegemony over the rest of the world, which they were right about, it turns out. But the progressive part of it is that people felt, it's good that economists recognize that there's this kind of need to regulate the economy. And it all goes hand in hand with the social democratic trends that you're getting in the US and the UK as well. So every once in a while, you'll see people, especially now in this 80-year anniversary, talking about how it was a moment where economists understood that, the economy shouldn't be at odds with people, but maybe people, society can work together with the economy. And on a global scale, maybe we could kind of balance things out a bit. And at the same time, turn a profit on the way, grow everybody's economy, etc. So that's the optimism at work here, at least. And that conference, the Bretton Woods Conference, sets up especially these two institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Matt, what's the World Bank? What's going on there?
Yeah, I'll tell you in 1 second. But before we get there, I guess I want to say one more thing about the the progressive storyline that gets told about these institutions. So the current like leader director, I guess, of the IMF is this woman named Kristalina Georgieva, who is she's like a Bulgarian economist. She is like she's right wing. I don't know. There's nothing else to say about her other than that. But it's really frustrating because if you kind of like read some things about her, she does have like a vested interest in so-called social justice, and she'll talk about feminism and that kind of thing. But like I don't know. It seems like such a farce when you recognize that the IMF is forcing extremely impoverished countries that to service debts that like basically nobody could ever repay, or if they did, it would take a massive overhaul. That is to say, too, debt that hurts women in those countries. I think predominantly women and gender minority people, I think, are the most affected by poverty, oftentimes. So, anyways, all to say the the woke IMF. Don't let them tell you that they are progressive institutions or organizations, because they are not. They are just capitalist organizations that do not care about poor people. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, we can get to this in a moment too, but I mean, they have been working overtime in the last few decades to convince everybody that they have learned their lessons and they are progressive now and they know all the right things to say and so on. But anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll come back to that
Sure.
in a minute. But it is very frustrating to see all that rhetoric flying around.
Yeah. It makes me feel like I am like losing touch with reality to read it sometimes. Okay. So Dean, a minute ago you asked me what's the World Bank? What does it do? How does it work? And I've got such good news for you. I don't personally know the answer to that question, but in Debt, the IMF, and the World Bank, Éric Toussaint does know the answer to that question. And when I read this book, I guess I learned it, so I do kind of personally know. But the question, how does the World Bank function? How does the IMF function? These are actually really important questions because the answer to them is frustratingly undemocratically. Which I guess is what you'd expect, but it's just like a little too like once you kind of like read into like how it works, it's just like how does anyone think this is good? So, anyways, let me read a bit here, and we'll talk about how stupid it is. How does the World Bank function? The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, was established at Bretton Woods in July 1944 at the initiative of 45 countries that had come together for the first monetary and financial conference of the United Nations. In 2010, it had 186 countries, with Kosovo as its latest addition, which joined in 2009. The IBRD's initial objective was to supply public capital for the reconstruction of Western Europe after the Second World War so that it remained a stable ally and provided market for the goods manufactured in the United States. It later shifted to financing the development of countries in the South, becoming, to use its own words, a, quote, vital source of financial and technical assistance to developing countries around the world. Each member country in the World Bank is granted a quota that determines what influence it can or cannot have within the bank. From this quota, established in relation to its economic situation, a complicated reckoning determines the country's voting power, a fixed part of 250 votes and a part that is proportional to its quota. Contrary to what happens in the UN General Assembly, where each country has one vote, with the majority exception of the Security Council, where 5 countries hold a right to veto. The World Bank system amounts to $1 equals 1 vote, but contrary to a company's shareholder, a country cannot decide to increase its World Bank quota in order to have more weight. The system is completely locked. Okay, I mean, this is just like an unnecessarily complicated system, like kind of peeking under the hood here, but it definitely does, give advantage to countries that have a lot of money when they enter. So pretty clear what's happening here. And then Toussaint goes on to say, as clearly can be seen, the developing countries cannot counter countries of the triad. That is like the sort of like several countries, including the United States, that sort of control the World Bank, which have the lion's share, and thus ensure ways of a means of systemically imposing their policies. So it's just like there's an unfair and clearly undemocratic distribution of voting rights in the World Bank. And it's that way because the United States wanted it to be that way, right? Like that's it. That's the whole reason that it exists in such a way, and it's structured so that a quote unquote developing country could never get the upper hand to assert more of its will. It's not like if suddenly, I don't know, Burkina Faso or whoever, right, suddenly like struck it rich, that they could pay more money into the system to get more of a say. It's just like it's set already. Sorry, it's done. Clearly done with somebody else's motivations in mind, not the safety and like well-being of the world or whatever.
Also, important to mention to the World Bank, every single president of it has been from the United States forever. There's never been a president from another country. And some of those presidents are extremely wild. One, for example, Robert McNamara, who people will remember as one of the architects of the Vietnam War under Kennedy and Johnson. He was the president of the World Bank for quite a while. Paul Wolfowitz, who was also an architect of the invasion of Iraq, he was the president of the World Bank, and he resigned because of an ethics scandal. Just a lot of incredibly weird choices if you look through a list of these presidents, but they are all from the U.S., which just goes to show the kind of hegemony that the U.S. has in an unapologetic way, like transparently. The United States is driving the ship of the ostensibly World Bank.
That's right. Okay, that's the World Bank. And then you might be asking yourself, okay, but what's the IMF? And the IMF is not that different. Like, I was trying to think of some things that were like that made them unique or something that really separated them as entities in the world, and maybe there are a few that we can come up with, but strikingly similar, actually. So the IMF, like its twin institution, the World Bank, was founded in 1944 at Bretton Woods. So that's the other kind of thing that comes out of that conference. Its aim was to stabilize the international finance system by regulating the flow of capital. In 2010, it had 186 members, the same as the World Bank. The organization is similar to the World Bank. Each country appoints a governor to represent it, usually the Minister of Finance or the governor of its central bank. The Board of Governors, the sovereign body of the IMF, meets once a year in October. It deliberates over important decisions such as the admission of new countries and the preparation of the budget. For the daily administration of IMF missions, the Board of Governors delegates its power to the Executive Board, composed of 24 members. Each of the following 8 countries enjoys the privilege of appointing a director: United States, Japan, Germany, France, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, China, and Russia. The remaining 16 are appointed by a group of countries that can differ slightly from the ones in the World Bank, and they can decide to hold a representative of a different nationality. It's noteworthy that France and the United Kingdom have succeeded in realizing the amazing feat of nominating the same representative on the executive board of both the IMF and the World Bank. I guess, like, again, this like extremely boring like information under the hood of how this organization works kind of shows you again like whose hegemony matters in these situations. So the IMF is a bit different in that it's like, I think, more European backed, and there might be a modicum more of democracy in its rulings, but not like, I think, in a way that matters. A little bit more on the World Bank and the IMF. As in the World Bank, a country's share determines its number of votes in the IMF, which corresponds to 250 votes plus one vote per 100,000 SDR portions of the share. So SDRs are these things called like special drawing rights, and like they don't necessarily it's complicated what they are. Maybe Dean, do you know more about what an SDR is?
Yeah, they are complicated. They are
It's like it's like about like a bundle of other currencies, right? It's like how those currencies are faring together.
Yes, it's valued
Right.
according to the value of a bundle of currency, a basket, they say, of currencies. But that it's complicated because they're technically currencies, but they often function as assets, which is all very complicated. I mean, they're not. This is I'm going to say this, and it is wrong, but maybe it will help some people connect the dots. It's like not completely dissimilar from how like Bitcoin is technically a currency, but actually a speculative asset. SDRs are not exactly that way, but they are kind of that way. And also, there's lots of debate about their utility, like. People during the pandemic, the IMF freed up a bunch of more SDRs to countries in order to like kind of cushion them a little bit from the financial problems. But if you read progressive economists, they will talk about how that was also a bit of a bait and switch. Maybe we'll talk about that at the end. It's all very complicated SDRs, but yes, they are technically currencies.
Very helpful. Okay, so there are 250 votes plus one vote per 100,000 Fortnite V-Bucks. And so that's how you get votes in the IMF. That's how you get like shares or like decision making power in the IMF. The IMF's executive board allocates a prominent place to, you guessed it, United States. Over 16% of voting rights is the United States, followed by Japan, Germany, the group led by Belgium, then France and the United Kingdom. And then this is an important note. By way of comparison, the group led by Rwanda, which is at the very bottom of like the amount of people or the amount of shares that like a group has, including 24 sub-Saharan African countries, French and Portuguese speaking, and representing 225 million people, has only 1.39% of the voting rights. I guess all this is so interesting to pull out here because like the United States gets 16% of voting rights. And then all of these other sort of like Western and Western aligned countries, like in Europe or whatever, Belgium, Germany, etc., the UK, I've named those already. They get like a bunch as well. And then like there's Rwanda, and then a group of 24 of Rwanda's closest friends, representing 225 million people. They get 1.39% of voting rights, which is like clearly an imperialistic situation. Like there's no other way to kind of put that. It's like so blatantly stupid on its face. It's just like you can't look at this setup about how the IMF works or how the World Bank works and think, yes, this is equitable and fair. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly. Also, the U.S. I mean, this book that we're talking about was written quite a long time ago, so the numbers are different now. But the structure is not that different. And important to note that like the US has 16% of voting rights at the time of the writing of this book, but it has nowhere near that amount of population relative to the global population. It has like maybe a quarter or maybe a fourth, or excuse me, it has maybe 4% of global population. So, you know, it's a pretty wild swing of imbalances there for sure.
Totally. All right, let me read one more bit from this Éric Toussaint book before we can move on to think about some other things. So this is like a historical body that obviously is acting kind of like in a moment of it comes out of this moment of anti-communism in Europe, also responding to like the Great Depression in the United States and so on. So, and we mentioned a few times how it is like, it favors a particular type of government in the world. It favors, obviously, the United States and Western Europe. But there are some other interesting bits here when it comes to like how it interacts with countries that maybe are not so interested in capitalism, or at least are trying to walk a bit of a different route, and what happens to those countries after the fact. So I guess I'll read this bit here as well from this Éric Toussaint book, and then The World Bank granted conditional loans to the countries that were trying to implement policies that did not comply with the dominant capitalist model. Capitalist, not capitalist, the World Bank would give you money, is basically the moral of the story. It would offer them the capital needed, telling the countries that the export of the raw materials they produced would be enough to cover both repayments and the modernization of their industrial base. By this means, the World Bank acquired the right of inspection over the economic policies practiced by these countries and strove to halt the development of independent policies and bring a number of leaders who were moving away from them. So like they're, like leftist governments, or like maybe left-leaning governments in Egypt in 1954 to 1970, and in Ghana from 1960 to 1966. All of these kind of people who were maybe like less interested in capitalism. The capitalism was still kind of able to keep its hooks in them, just through the World Bank as sort of like a disciplinary measure. When any leaders of the South refused to comply, the Northern powers did not hesitate to overthrow and replace them with dictators. So, for example, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba from the Congo in 1961, a few others, people you might know, like Salvador Allende in Chile, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso in 87, all of these people, right? They are people who rejected the idea of capitalism and also like the rule of the World Bank, that kind of stuff. So I guess like all I'm trying to say with this though is that like there's a clear like axe this whole organization has to grind, and like you can be sort of like a left-leaning government if you want to, but you still have to take money from the World Bank, and you have to let the World Bank see your books. And if you don't, then there's a price to pay. If you're not going to play ball, then I guess the global North will take retribution against you. Capitalism is a global order, and the World Bank is definitely a part of how that global order works and disciplines countries who want to do something different.
Right, and on purpose. Like that is the purpose of these institutions, is to maintain a global financial order explicitly. Like that's why they were set up. And like I said earlier, the story that people like to tell is that these institutions were basically progressive or kind of liberal until neoliberalism really got going, especially in the 80s when the IMF started doing these things called structural adjustment programs, which are definitely bad and qualitatively worse for sure. Basically, the scheme went such that the IMF would give you a loan, but only under the condition that you would structurally adjust your economy in massive ways in order to receive that loan, with the assumption that by doing that, you would also therefore kind of open your economies up to massive capitalist growth that would allow you to pay back the loan really easily. But guess what? That's not how anything works anywhere. And so it failed. But the failure especially forced these economies to essentially gut all their public infrastructure. This was sort of the capitalist scheme. This is like the days of Reagan and Thatcher and so on. So they gut their public infrastructure. They release tons of regulations on the market, with the understanding that trickle-down economics works. And so if you just kind of make the field a lot easier for capitalists to be capitalists, they'll make all their money and they'll pour it back into your country, and all that wealth will trickle down and you'll be able to pay back the loan just fine. On the contrary, what happened is countries basically gave up public investments. They reoriented their economies to produce tons of exports, meaning their products are leaving their countries. And in the process, the profits also left their countries, and there was no kind of, the promise that all that money was going to go back into your country did not materialize. So they were left economically devastated and essentially in a subservient relationship to the global North by exporting all these really cheap products. And they had no regulatory means of, producing like taxable income for their own countries and so on. All very complicated, and definitely some bizarre and incredibly tragic things involved here. I mean, people have died as a result of these policies, lots of stuff. So the story is that the IMF was good until it started doing this, and then it became bad, and we should stop doing that. And the IMF also tells that story about its own self. It says, basically, if you read, actually, if you want to be a huge IMF head, you can get a publication called Finance and Development from the IMF. They will just send it to your door. And in it, they talk a bunch about kind of how they've learned their lesson. This was bad. They shouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it again, etc. But the problem with this story is that before neoliberalism, the IMF and World Bank, in addition to the kind of political maneuvering that Matt had just explained, they also showed pretty clearly what kind of development they were interested in and what kinds they weren't. So in another book by Éric Toussaint that just came out recently called The World Bank, A Critical History, he points out that the World Bank lends money for specific projects like a road, a port infrastructure, a dam, an agricultural project, etc. In its first 17 years of operation, the bank did not grant a single loan for a school, health unit, drainage system, or drinking water conveyance. Until 1962, all loans without exception were put into electrical power, infrastructure, transportation routes, dams, agricultural machinery, promotion of export crops, or to a marginal extent, modernization of processing industries. And the idea here is that the World Bank was trying to, it said that it was trying to provide funds that would let these countries, build their own productive infrastructure. But in fact, that all came, first of all, at the expense of not investing in public utilities and education and healthcare and so on, which is a pretty big deal. And then secondly, this sort of the production of this infrastructure was done such that these countries would also be integrated into the world market and producing for global north economies as well. So that's kind of the export crop piece of it. So even before neoliberalism, the liberal scheme of these institutions was not in the business of providing, public goods and care and so on, but in these other kinds of goals. And it's especially frustrating because sometimes people will tie this to social democracy and they'll be like, the social democratic trend in the world was mirrored in an international way by the Bretton Woods institutions. But it's a classic example of like social democracy for me and not for thee, right? Social democracy, you're allowed to have that in the US and the UK. You're not allowed to have that in the global South. And in fact, the social democracy that does happen in the global North is at the expense, explicitly and structurally, of people in the global South. So this is all long before Reagan and Thatcher started, making things worse. It was already bad.
There's also something to be said here too about, like when you do transform the agricultural production of a country, whatever that country might be, from like a subsistence type of production towards a surplus production, it's also like a pretty big act of colonialism that is worth mentioning as well, right? Like, you're going to take the crops and the agricultural practices of a really specific geographical place, and then you're going to truck in, like genetically engineered rice or corn or whatever, and tell them you're going to grow this instead, right? That's colonialism. That is like a loss of local knowledge and culture and all kinds of things like that. So I don't know. It's gross all the way down, and to do that is bad. I guess that's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So like we said also, it's not the case that people just didn't notice this until neoliberalism. And in fact, the liberation theologians were on the ball pretty early. And you can find it especially in Gustavo Gutierrez's book, A Theology of Liberation, which is usually identified as the first big book that came out in liberation theology in Latin America. It was published in Spanish in 1971. And Gutierrez had been writing about these things already in the 60s, but the book came out in 71. And in it, he says this, which I'll just read, and he's referring to the Bretton Woods scheme. He says, "The term development has synthesized the aspirations of poor peoples during the last few decades. Recently, however, it's become the object of severe criticism due both to the deficiencies of the development policies proposed to the poor countries to lead them out of their underdevelopment, and also to the lack of concrete achievements of the interested governments. This is the reason why developmentalism, a term derived from development, is now used in a pejorative sense, especially in Latin America." So developmentalism, this is the philosophy of Bretton Woods and others. "Much has been said in recent times about development," he says. "Poor countries competed for the help of rich countries. There were even attempts to create a certain development mystique, Support for development was intense in Latin America in the 50s, producing high expectations. But since the supporters of development did not attack the roots of the evil, they failed and caused instead confusion and frustration. And by the roots of the evil, he means capitalism. One of the most important reasons for this turn of events is that development, approached from an economic and modernizing point of view, has been frequently promoted by international organizations closely linked to groups and governments which control the world economy. And here he footnotes the IMF explicitly. The changes encouraged were to be achieved within the formal structure of the existing institutions without challenging them. Great care was exercised, therefore, not to attack the interests of large international economic powers, nor those of their natural allies, the ruling domestic interest groups. Furthermore, the so-called changes were often nothing more than new and underhanded ways of increasing power of strong economic groups. So Gutierrez, already in the 60s and into the early 70s, is pointing out that these kind of institutions, the IMF, World Bank, and others too, like the Inter-American Development Bank, there's lots of kind of like sub-banks that do similar kind of work regionally. Essentially, you know, they exist on paper to try to encourage development in countries in the global south, but in fact, they're practically tied and kind of looped into this global capitalist process by which all the development, so-called, that happens in the global south is finally undermined by the fact that they're a link in a chain that extracts value from the south to the north. And something that Gutierrez and others pointed out is that the underdevelopment of global south countries is the other side of the coin to the development of global north countries, which is to say, it's not that everybody's just kind of developing and some are slower than others, and we just have to catch them up. But on the contrary, the development of global north countries depends on keeping global south countries always in a subordinate position. So you have liberation theology already kind of on this critique, again, long before neoliberalism comes around.
Man, it's always really interesting to see those moments in time where like theology is ahead of the game. And I think liberation theology is like one of the places that like that does that most frequently, that like constantly has like a really good analysis of really exploitive economic situations. But you know, sometimes you can be so used to theologians not being able to say anything useful about the world, but then you know you have people like Gustavo Gutierrez who like really can say something important. I mean, Dean, like you've got Catholic social organization brain for sure. Like, what's your take on some of this stuff about like development? I mean, do you see that still as like a pretty like prevalent sort of like frame of reference for people doing like charity work and solidarity work in the world, or have a lot of people kind of like left the whole idea of development behind?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely still operative. I think that there are some organizations that have moved in more of a solidarity direction rather than a charitable or even developmental direction over time, and that's good to see. But for example, like the government policies or the government rhetoric, like if you look at what USAID has to say, USAID is the United States essentially kind of humanitarian and development agency. Its philosophy is totally in this paradigm, and it explicitly lends with the interest of not only encouraging development, but also encouraging social change, political change, trying to organize countries more in line with a kind of liberal capitalist model. You know, they spend USAID, an ostensibly development-oriented organization, they spend millions of dollars in Cuba, for example, trying to foment resistance to the Cuban government, even though if you ask like the United Nations, Cuba is a model of how many countries in the global south could and should develop even under the conditions of the blockade. So yeah, you know, developmentalism, it's a kind of classic paternalistic view that the richer countries, they have this responsibility to the global south. And I mean, you kind of get like, you get this sense of, if you ever talk to like wealthy people or upper middle class people about like engaging homeless people, you can see a similar logic where it's like, oh, I've been blessed with so much, I just have to like give back to my community. And so whatever, they'll like raise money for a homeless shelter, but don't really understand that maybe they're like a real estate agent who's like, you know, has like several Airbnbs and are contributing to the housing crisis and so on. It's the same kind of thing at a national scale, that these countries are trying to patch up, you know, wounds with band-aids, but they are the ones actually causing the wounds in the first place. So right. Developmentalism, it's still alive and well for sure.
Yeah, it's part of the way of thinking where, you look at society and all of its problems and you think, yes, the results, the conclusions of our society, they're pretty bad and we have to deal with those in some ways. But the things that cause those results and conclusions, those are good, unfortunately.
Right. Exactly. And actually, I mean, we've talked about these issues, including this book that we're talking about right now on the podcast in the past a few times. So maybe some people have deja vu. You're not wrong. We've talked about it before. But something else we've talked about is Franz Hinkle-Lemaire, one of the great theological economists in liberation theology. He has a whole essay about what he calls the entrepreneurial metaphysics of the IMF, which is to say that there's a whole kind of imaginary world that these institutions function in, where they tell themselves stories about the power of entrepreneurs, the power of capitalism, the almost magical ability to alleviate poverty. And of course, it is magical. It's not it's not real. And what I like about liberation theologians is that they don't accept those terms. They subject them to a pretty rigorous analysis, and they also try to figure out, if you say these things, if you have a developmentalist paradigm, what else does that commit you to? And it commits you to a lot of racism, for example, right? That like poor countries, what they really need is rich countries to kind of teach them how to do economics right. Or they are bad at governing themselves, and so they need somebody to look over their shoulder and cook the books right so that they can sort it all out. Or they're bad at, good governance, they're all corrupt, and I mean, this is basically what even documents from the World Bank and IMF will say. Like, they talk about global South governments that way. And it's a classic case of, global North kind of privileged structural racism for sure.
Right. We have an episode about that Hinkle-Lemaire essay you can go back and listen to. The ideology of entrepreneurship and the metaphysics of entrepreneurship is such a funny term. It makes me think of this one time. Sorry, this is a digression, but again, this is our podcast. We can do that. One time I was at this guest lecture at the university I used to teach at, and it was from somebody talking about creativity and entrepreneurship, because of course that is exactly the type of evil that a Christian university would welcome into their classrooms. But anyways, this guy came in and he was like, "Okay, let's do a little thought experiment here. Let's all just take 30 seconds, maybe more, like 2 minutes, I don't know what it was, to come up with a product that would just revolutionize the world. Like, you guys all have good ideas, I bet. Let's just come up with an idea that would revolutionize the world." And then everyone came up with the dumbest ideas on the planet. And instead of anything that would actually revolutionize the world, somebody had suggested a piece of edible tape that you could use to hold a taco together. So I guess I know that's the ingenuity of entrepreneurship. That's the best they got, is something to keep your taco from falling apart, not anything that's actually going to help anybody.
That's right. This is what the socialists can't dream of, that kind of innovation.
Exactly.
The story continues also, liberation theologians, it's really, really easy to find them criticizing the World Bank, the IMF, the global economic arrangement, and that's basically their shtick, right? Is that they're theologians who are willing to actually read economists. What a wild idea. Would love to see theologians rediscover that skill, and it would be very helpful to me specifically. But liberation theologians have continued to look at this from the global South. And one thing I really like about liberation theology is these people are willing to read incredibly boring speeches by incredibly boring people, like heads of the IMF, heads of the World Bank. And they're very sensitive to kind of what is being said, which is the kind of thing that most people in the global North, myself included, don't go looking for speeches by the head of the IMF unless you're working on something, but they are attuned to it. And I thought I'd pull out one more contemporary example. This is in a book by Ivan Petrella called Beyond Liberation Theology, a book that I have a lot of complicated feelings about, but what he says here I think is very interesting. So he's talking about kind of the ideology of these institutions. And he talks about a famous memo that was written by Lawrence Summers, who was the president of Harvard University more recently. Now I forget what he does. I don't know, more nefarious things. But he was previously the chief economist at the World Bank. And he sent around this memo in the early 90s talking about climate change and the market. And here's a little bit of what's in the memo quoted by Petrella. The measurements of the cost of health-impairing pollution depends on the foregone earnings from increased morbidity and mortality. From this point of view, a given amount of health-impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. The costs of pollution are likely to be non-linear, as the initial increments of pollution probably have very low cost. I've always thought that the underpopulated countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. Their air quality is probably vastly inefficiently low compared to Los Angeles or Mexico City. Only the lamentable facts that so much pollution is generated by non-tradable industries and that the unit transport costs of solid waste are so high prevent world welfare-enhancing trade in air pollution and waste. He goes on to also criticize the idea that there should be a right to a clean environment. I'll pause here. I'll say some more in a minute, but truly supervillain kind of rhetoric here from Larry Summers, a guy who is still on the internet, occasionally tweeting his bizarre ideas into the void, and who also joined the Clinton administration and the Obama administration as a big, important economic thinker. This is a guy who is like literally arguing for like actively polluting poor people because they deserve it, essentially, is kind of what he's getting at here.
Well, what you got to understand is that they're under-polluting their own ecology. They can handle a little bit, I think. We can just put a little bit of ours in there, I think. I feel like, listen, right. If you think this way, you need to do some serious soul searching. Like, it's got to be, I don't know, go to therapy, read some communist texts or something, talk to God, figure out why you're wrong. But man, something has got to give here in this situation. Like, there's got to be some way you have to redeem your brain from this type of thinking. It is so completely brain poisoned. What an awful person and way to exist in the world, and a terrible thing to think.
Yeah. There was a great response by Brazil's Secretary of the Environment at the time that Petrella includes here, Jose Lutzenberger, who wrote to Summers, quote, "Your reasoning is perfectly logical but totally insane. Your thoughts provide a concrete example of the unbelievable alienation, reductionistic thinking, social ruthlessness, and the arrogant ignorance of many conventional economists concerning the nature of the world we live in. If the World Bank keeps you as vice president, it will lose all credibility. To me, it would confirm what I often said. The best thing that could happen would be for the bank to disappear." And actually, that guy got fired in Brazil, and Summers did leave the bank, but he went to the Clinton administration. So just an incredibly wild geopolitical scene here. But it gives you the sense, right, that like these are the kinds of people who are making decisions at this level of international finance, and they're welcomed into even progressive circles, the Democrats and so on. And what I think is really useful about liberation theology is that, you know, as I said, they're willing to like follow these kinds of things, point them out, and say that like Christians should care and know that people like Larry Summers are out there writing supervillain memos about how they want to pollute Africa.
It's so bizarre. Like, I get that there are supervillain-minded people like Larry Summers in the world, but sometimes they don't often like write down their dastardly plan like they're a Bond villain or something. Like, learn the difference between inside thoughts and outside thoughts, bud. Like, come on. It's just a real problem with emotional regulation on this guy.
That's right. A lot going on there for sure. Like I said, I think there's a lot more that could be sort of parsed out from liberation theology, and I'm sure more will be, because next year there's going to be a big Jubilee year, and everybody's going to keep talking about the IMF and the World Bank and debt and all that kind of stuff, and I expect we'll see probably a lot more. But I think it's important for people to be rereading all that material, because liberation theology, as you said earlier, Matt, it does have this kind of like antenna that allows it to get ahead of a lot of things and, you know, not wait around for neoliberalism to intensify exploitation that is already happening and already bad. And I think it can kind of give the lie to certain things. You know, like there's a guy, Tony Annette, on Twitter, and he's an author. He used to work at the IMF. He wrote a book called Cathonomics. Lots to say about that, I'm sure. But he is often talking about the Bretton Woods institutions as, you know, essentially like good social democratic policies that align quite readily with Catholic social teaching in a lot of cases. And I think it's important to recognize that, well, there were Catholics who were actually outside of the global north, and they had a very different perspective on how this was going for them specifically in the South. And if you have to pick people to listen to form a Catholic opinion about global finance, you should pick it from the people who are on the wrong side of it, not those who are, thankfully for them, on the right side of it.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Yeah, well, it's super interesting. I mean, the IMF is something that I know about, like, peripherally. I know it. I know about it because I do this podcast with you, and I think like in my normal everyday life, though, I never think about it. I'm like never thinking about the IMF, and I think that if you were to go up to a normal person that doesn't listen to this podcast, and you asked them about the IMF, they probably wouldn't know either, which I think is so wild that there's like this giant, awful, ghastly set of organizations in the world that the United States basically does run or at least influence greatly. But we don't really even think about them. But like you said a minute ago, Dean, like, you know, there are people elsewhere in the world whose lives basically hang in the balance about what the IMF says or what the World Bank says. So I don't know. I feel like there's like some reckoning there to do with that kind of awful existential truth as people of the global north.
Definitely. And I think it's also, good to recognize that we do have the privilege of being, having the choice to care or know about the IMF or not. And my brain goes to a country like Kenya right now where everybody knows about the IMF because it has been getting people in the streets and also getting people killed just in the last month or so from now. People might have seen that there were quite a lot of headlines where in July of this month, the president, he proposed a tax hike in Kenya, which there's lots to say about that, but it is definitely related to the kind of IMF deals that he has made. And Kenyans were pissed about that because, you know, why should they be forced to basically like service the debt of the Kenyan government by giving up even more of the little income that they have? So they protested that situation. And the government responded with a lot of violence. And finally, the president did actually renege on the tax hike, but it has kind of locked them into some really challenging stuff. And the IMF reforms have kind of been slowly like reshaping Kenyan society. For example, the president suspended subsidies for fuel and fertilizers, which to me sounds like a pretty strong relationship to the old structural adjustment regime. The IMF has explicitly backed certain finance bills and so on. And it's a really wild kind of, you know, return to the IMF's interventionist attitudes, or not even return, but maybe continuation of those things, despite the fact that, you know, you have an IMF president every once in a while who will say we shouldn't do that. They are still doing it, and people are literally dying as a result of it. So, you know, some people have the luxury of choosing to know what the IMF is, and some people are forced to reckon with it. And I think it's incumbent on people in the global north to make that choice to learn, because we won't be forced, and we are also forcing other people to figure it out.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, we have to come to terms with our place economically in the world and our privilege in the world, not just like socially or whatever, but economically in terms of big institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Our lives are, you know, the way they are because of the exploitation of other people. That's a wrap. That's a wrap on 80 years since the founding of Bretton Woods institutions. The conclusion is that we don't like them, that they're bad, that the only thing that would probably fix things like the IMF and the World Bank is a complete break with capitalism. I think that's it. Don't let them tell you that they are progressive, woke institutions. Come on, like, we're all smarter than that. I don't know. What else? What other takeaways do we have, Dean?
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely return to this stuff from some other angles down the line, because I am forced to think about it a lot right now, specifically at my job and elsewhere. So I'm sure we'll find some other stuff. There's a ton of literature out there even about, like, you know, what to do about the IMF and World Bank, and how could countries break away from it, and what can countries do to kind of refuse the loans that they have already taken out. Like, there's lots of interesting history going on there that we can review. And like I said, I think theologians are about to engage in this theme in a renewed way, I hope anyway, in 2025 with the Jubilee year that Pope Francis said is going to happen in 2025. So my hope is that there will actually be a lot more opportunity to continue thinking this through and dealing with it. There's in the year 2000, there was a huge global push for debt cancellation, and it was successful but not without complications. And so people are kind of thinking of repeating that. And it'd be interesting too to maybe follow up on this episode with other ways that countries are in debt. It used to be the case that the IMF and World Bank were some pretty primary holders of debt and like bilateral debt, but now there's a lot more private creditors in the mix, and regulating them is very hard. So lots more to say about it. It's a complicated picture, but yes, 80 years. The IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, they've had 80 years to figure out how to make an economy that works for everybody. And they didn't, and they're not going to. And I can't imagine another 80 years from now they'll have sorted it out. And I think people should be willing to say that in a big and loud way. And I think church people should be willing to say that.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you're hearing, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you do that, you can get access to our cool behind the paywall only Discord channel where we're just a bunch of people talking about things and stuff, sharing news. It's great. It's a great community to be a part of. Be a part of the gang. Share memes with us. Do other things with us. Sometimes we have book clubs. Sometimes we play very strange tabletop role-playing games. I mean, there's just a whole lot of things going on here, and it's great. All right. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Logical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
Get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up.